In any event, I'm Lucia, and I may be the oldest grandmother here because I'm a great-grandmother. I have the grandmother of Josie, who's named for two of my Sicilian grandmothers, Josephina and Lucia, which is my name, and Josephina is also my sister's name. It's very complex, but we call her Josie. And then just a month ago, 2 months ago, we had Adam Murphy Landreth, who's named for his father's side. Anyway, Wally and I have been married like 60 years, and we have many grandchildren and counting, because we have significant others, and we don't know how significant the others are, but we have many. And in any event, I suppose my most important accomplishment in life is that we brought up 3 nurturant sons, which is, I think, one of the tasks. It's a joyous task, but it's what women are, that's one of our gifts to the world. Anyway, today, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my work. I'm an odd feminist. I'm an African-centered cultural feminist historian. And recently, I've been trying to figure out how I got there. And it's very interesting and not all that joyous, because you have eruptions from your unconscious, which help you figure out. In any event, I'll just start reading. I'm a Sicilian-American feminist cultural historian who teaches women's spirituality in San Francisco at the Graduate University California Institute of Indical Studies, which may have the only doctoral program in women's spirituality in the world, not without some pain along the way and cultural struggles, because we're all different. Anyway, my research, after I was fired at San Francisco State at the end of the 60s for joining the students in demand for African studies and opposing the Vietnam War. Most of my life has been opposing some war or other. Anyway, it turned out to be a gift. You don't know at the time, but it enabled me to go to Italy and look for my grandmothers. And I ended up finding my Sicilian grandmothers, and that took me to Africa, because Sicily, I should have brought a map, is only a few kilometers from the coast of Africa. And that's called the Canal of Sicily, which wasn't there until the ice melted and at the end of the Ice Age. So that I claim, well, my great-great-grandmothers were African. And the African influence on Sicily is very, very pronounced. And it's, after the ice melted, there's this little strait. But the first African migrations out of the continent of Africa were into the Mediterranean, in the 2 major islands are Sicily and Sardinia. Sicily is my ancestral island. My father was born there and all my grandparents, but Sicily has been somewhat ruined by the church, so that it's hard to figure out the prehistory of Sicily. And it was also a seat of the Inquisition. I know my grandmothers were tortured by the Inquisition. In any event, I found my great-grandmothers in Africa, and the first African migration passed around the Mediterranean, which were to the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, as well as Mediterranean countries of Italy, France, and Spain. And this is the topic of my book, which I hope to get to the publisher by January. It's an Italian publisher called Laboratorio Poesis in Puglia. But it's about the first African migration paths. And in this book, which I'll read to you, there's a chapter on Sardinia, which is the island which probably is the Museum of Europe because it has hundreds of, they're called idoletti, little idols, which is a patriarchal term for little figurines of the mother. And 95% of them are women, 5% are men. And at the end of his life, Sardinia's greatest archaeologist, Liu, said there's no doubt that this is a woman divinity. It's interesting to me that men in Europe are more able to accept this than they are in the West or in the United States and in Britain. The point of this paper for this conference is that everybody's genetic and cultural legacy is African, and that people of every continent of the earth have inherited in their DNA a primordial predisposition of caring and sharing, which mothers taught their children in first communities of Africa. And for this I'm indebted to Bernadette Muthian, who's here somewhere. Anyway, and I'm indebted to Luca Cavalli Sforza, who's the great geneticist, Italian, and he taught at Stanford, where I met him. But he's the geneticist who proved in the DNA that Africans had migrated to every single continent of the earth. And then later, one of his students, Spencer Wells, pointed out, because this is upsetting to men, the DNA is transmitted from the mother to the daughter. But Spencer Wells has pointed out, and it's interesting that his is much more acceptable because he tracks the Y chromosome in the DNA, which is the transmission from the father to the son. But the DNA precedes, the Y chromosome is in the DNA, just keep that in mind. Anyway, the point is, Luca Cavalli Sforza said that the first migrations out of Africa were 50,000 BCE. And Spencer Wells, his student, who's incidentally, you've seen his documentary called The Journey of Man in many alternative radio stations. He's pushed that date back to 70,000 BCE. Now, that's correct. Now, Luca pointed out, Luca read my book. We were both at Stanford. I was in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. And he read my book, Black Madonnas, and he invited me to lunch because he was interested in the cultural implications of what he had done, finding the DNA in every continent of the earth, peoples of the earth. But he said something that electrified me. He said that these were demic, D-E-M-I-C, migrations, which meant that Africans took their beliefs with them. Now, this is very upsetting to cultural historians if they think it sounds like the zeitgeist and they get worried about that. But as a cultural historian, I was trained by male historians very well at UC Berkeley, who gave me a first-rate male education, but it stood me in. I've been recently trying to recover that period because I kind of suppressed it because at my doctoral examination, one of the professors said, all male, of course, said out loud, "She doesn't look like a professor." And the second thing was that one of the professors said to me, "Well, you know a great deal about transcendentalism, but what was the price of hemp in Kentucky in 1820? In any event, they wouldn't pass me nor flunk me, which has stood me in good stead as a mentor of graduate students because I have tremendous empathy for any graduate student who crosses my path. And I produced some brilliant ones. I think Marguerite Vigoglioso is in this audience. In any event, well, I'm skipping ahead. I'm a historian who thinks of history as a spiral theory of history. It doesn't go like this, which is the Western mode. It goes like this. And I hope it's going up. But what it does is give you patience, because it means you go 2 steps backward before you go forward. Or you look to history, not because it's a total answer, but because it holds possibilities also. It also enables you to get through some very black, dark periods, and I've had them. Because you know that this low point will go like this. That's hard when you're way down here, but if you can think of that, it'll get you through some hard times. Anyway, the earliest object of veneration we know, proven by archaeologists as well as cultural historians, is a woman. It starts out with her signs. I don't know if Eleanor's in the audience. There she is. From whom I learned the importance of anaconic as well as iconic symbols. I know all my students fall in love with my book on Black Madonnas because that's an image who is so powerful and moving. But before she is anthropomorphized, she left her signs. Her signs are the pubic V and the color dark ochre red, which is the color of childbirth and menstrual blood, from whom I'm terribly indebted to Judy Grant, who's not here, who's made a whole metaformic theory. Anyway, what's happening in our time, I think, is a tremendously interesting convergence of disciplines. And I suppose my contribution is that when I was thrown out of academia after I was fired, I discovered that my antecedents were African, as everybody's in the world, but mine are really close, because if you ever see a map, Sicily is like, well, it's just a few kilometers from the coast of Africa, and I do know it was African before the ice melted. In any event, those signs of the mother, and I call her the Dark Mother in my book, which has been translated into Italian and French and distributed all over Africa as well as Europe and the Caribbean, which scares me sometimes. It scares me because the other day at open house for admission to CIS, there was a young woman who kept looking at me, and she'd just come back from Russia, and she found in a little unknown little village of old believers, they called, this is before Russian Orthodoxy, who'd kept their beliefs all through the communist period, and who had a Black Madonna there. And in this little bitty village, there was a copy of my book, Dark Mother, which was the French edition, La Mémoire. And that gives you really, makes you very nervous. Although it's also, I mean, you don't know, first of all, if you're a teacher, you don't know what you're saying, how it's being taken, embraced. Second of all, you don't know who's reading your books. Anyway, so very early in the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, there are late Paleolithic and early Neolithic icons of a round mother. After I was fired at SF State and Eleanor Gaydon hired me at CIIS, and I do thank you in my memoirs for that. I have conniption fits with my colleagues, but that's the only place in the world I would teach. Anyway, So I took students with me around the Mediterranean, and one of the places we went to was Sardinia, which was transforming, because as Fiorenza, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza points out, there's a hermeneutics of place. There's like, when you are in a place that resonates someplace in one of your levels of consciousness, you learn something which you may not be able to talk about, but you learn it on some level. And this, incidentally, has a tremendous implication for the fact that Africans took their beliefs with them to every continent. That means everybody on Earth, on one of the levels of their consciousness, and probably 7/8 of it is preconscious and unconscious, has this predisposition to caring and sharing, which is, in our time, a real symbol of hope. Anyway. The book I'm writing is called The Future Has an Ancient Mother, African Legacy of Caring and Sharing on Primordial Migration Paths, the Case of the Mediterranean, in which I start with Sardinia and Sicily, Apulia, Umbria. The most important thing is all my students take some part of the world as their own, and they write dissertations on it. I have one, for example, right now, Mary Beth Moser has just come back from the Trentino, which is the northern part of Italy, where the Council of Trent was held, which was held to root out superstition. Superstition is all the things we believe in. And then they proceeded to the Inquisition. But what she has come back with is all the pagan symbols she's found. And I was talking to her on the phone the other day, and she was making me crazy because she said, here's the pubic V right above the museum. In any event, I guess one of my messages is that those pagan symbols are the bottom stratum of every religion of the world. I teach in my concentration for the doctorate, which I mentor students. One of the concentrations is world religions, the substratum. And Catholicism is full of symbols. And a lot of them are locked up in the Vatican of prehistory and the mother-centered civilization. But if you go with an open mind, an open ear, and an open heart, you will find those symbols everywhere. So that, for example, our trip to Sardinia was very, very moving and transforming, and we couldn't, because the church didn't get there, the Romans didn't get there, the Greeks didn't get there, has kept a very ancient way of living, which is that way of living that we all began with, which is in harmony with the universe. But I digress. I'm going too fast. All right. So at this point, I want to just tell you that from my stance as a historian, this is a period of a tremendous convergence of disciplines. And I thought I'd just list some of them. The Afrocentrists, who have insisted since Cheikh Anta Diop after World War II, and who incidentally had a hell of a time getting his dissertation through the Sorbonne. Anyway, that civilization began in Africa. African women scholars like Bernadette Mouthian, who discussed the caring and sharing of the Khoisan. I think she's going to talk about that in our earliest communities. The Jungian scholar of prehistory Emmanuel Anati, who has found symbols of the African mother in the rock art of the world. Afrocentrists like Molefi Asante, who has trained a generation of African American scholars in the true history of the world, which begins in Africa. See, what makes me a little odd, a little controversial, is that I've been invited